The cold didn't ask permission. It crept in through the cracks, settled in the bones, and stayed. Inside a one-room cottage on the edge of a snow-draped village, Thomas curled around his youngest child, their limbs tangled in a shared pile of straw and rags. The wind howled outside, rattling the thatched roof. There was no central heating, no thermostat to adjust. Just the hope that the fire-banked hearth would still be glowing by dawn. This was winter for a medieval peasant. Sleeping through freezing nights wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. And survival demanded creativity, compromise, and tolerance for conditions modern folks would call unlivable. Beds, in the way we know them now, didn't exist for most peasants. What passed for bedding was often a rough pile of straw tossed over dirt or stone. If the family was lucky, that straw might be stuffed into an old sack or bits of cloth to keep it from spreading all over the floor. Think of it like a medieval upgrade from economy to premium economy. Not cozy, but at least contained. That same straw was far from fresh. By midwinter, after months of use, it was damp, crawling with lice and fleas, and smelled like everything the family had eaten, sweated, or spilled. Replacing it wasn't an option. Resources were too scarce. If you had to sleep on straw mixed with mold or animal droppings, you did it. The straw might poke your back, but you were alive, and in winter, that was enough. Not everyone even had a raised platform or bed frame. Some families slept directly on the floor. Oddly, that had one benefit. You couldn't roll off the bed when there was no bed to begin with. But sleeping on the floor meant being closer to the cold ground, which sucked body heat like a sponge. That's where animals came in, not just for companionship, but for warmth. Chickens sometimes nested under straw bedding, and it wasn't uncommon to find a pig snuggled into the warmest part of the sleeping pile. Nobody kicked them out. That pig might have been the only reason your toes weren't blue by morning. Pillows? Not really a thing. Peasants used whatever was handy. Wadded-up clothes, a chunk of wood wrapped in fabric, maybe a small sack of dried herbs if they had it. Anything that raised your head even slightly while masking the smell of unwashed bodies and decaying bedding was a win. With no waterproof coverings, any spills or leaks from the roof went straight into the bedding. Rain, snow, animal accidents, it all soaked in. During the coldest months, when doors and shutters were sealed tight to keep out the wind, the resulting stench was overwhelming. But if you complained, you were missing the point. Warmth trumped cleanliness. Privacy was another modern luxury medieval peasants never knew. Families didn't sleep in individual rooms. They didn't even sleep in separate beds. Everyone, parents, children, grandparents, visiting relatives, all bundled together on the same straw heap. This wasn't about bonding. It was about surviving. Body heat was the most reliable defense against the cold. Kids slept in the middle of the group because it was the warmest spot. Complaining about it was short-titted once the draft hit your face on the edge. There was no such thing as personal space. People snored, kicked, talked in their sleep. Someone always hogged the covers. Someone always had bad breath, or worse. You dealt with it, because the alternative of sleeping alone near the cold wall or by the drafty door meant waking up frozen, or not waking up at all. When a traveler showed up needing shelter, they weren't given a guest room. They joined the pile. Hospitality meant squeezing one more body into the sleeping cluster. Nothing breaks the ice faster than actually needing someone else's body heat to survive the night. Most medieval cottages were shockingly small, around 400 square feet total. That's smaller than your average modern studio apartment. And it had to house not just people, but livestock too. That's right. Animals often shared the living space. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens, not for fun, but because each one was a little walking furnace. A full-grown cow could warm the room by several degrees, enough to make a critical difference in whether a child made it through the night without frostbite. Of course, the house didn't smell great. It didn't sound peaceful either. Chickens clucked, goats chewed loudly, the pigs snored, and someone always farted. But when your reality was a winter night so cold that your breath froze in the air, those animals weren't a nuisance. They were a lifeline. The only real heat source was the hearth. and it had to be babied. There was no flipping a switch. Each night, someone had to bank the fire, a method of covering embers with ash to keep them smoldering without burning out. If it failed, the family woke up to a dead hearth and a serious problem. Starting a new fire meant flint, steel, and time. Cold fingers and frozen kindling made that task a nightmare. Some villages had traditions where families could beg embers from a neighbor, but even that meant trudging through snow and praying someone else's fire had survived. Kids didn't fear monsters under the bed. They feared waking up to find the fire gone cold. Keeping the hearth alive was more than a household chore. It was a lifeline. In medieval Europe, losing the fire overnight could mean the difference between waking up cold and not waking up at all. Without matches or lighters, reigniting a dead hearth required striking flint against steel to create a spark, then carefully nursing that spark into flame, using dry tinder and breath. It was an art, and one that could be maddeningly difficult with numb fingers on a bitter morning. That's why families developed a routine. Firekeeping wasn't assigned to a single person. Instead, it rotated. One night the mother might stay up late to tend the embers. The next, it was the eldest child's job to wake in the darkness and slip a splinter of wood into the ash to keep the flame alive. Everyone took a turn because everyone's life depended on it. Communities helped each other too. If a fire went out, a neighbor might be willing to share a glowing ember, but that meant venturing into the snow with a pot or covered scoop, trudging to another home, and hoping their hearth had survived the night. Some villages even had designated firekeepers, households known to maintain strong hearths that others could rely on. Fire-bearing, as it was called, was a form of medieval mutual aid, a recognition that fire was too precious to hoard when survival was on the line. With wood in short supply, medieval peasants became masters of efficiency. They didn't build big fires, they built smart ones. Evidence from excavated hearths and historical records shows that most fires were small, low, and tightly contained. A single family used a fraction of the wood a modern household might burn. Every twig counted, especially by February, when supplies were low and the forests near villages had already been picked clean. Instead of relying solely on firewood, many families used heated stones or bricks. These were placed directly into the fire until they glowed with heat, then carefully removed using tongs or cloth and wrapped in rags before being placed in the bedding. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. A single heated stone could stay warm for hours and take the edge off the cold straw beneath a sleeping child. The hearth, though, was more than just a source of heat. It was the heart of the home. Once the sun went down, the fire provided the only light. Families gathered around it not for leisure, but out of necessity. Meals were cooked there, tools were repaired by its glow, and stories were shared not for entertainment, but to keep spirits from sinking too low. Fire was memory, safety, warmth, and life, all wrapped into one small glowing center. And yet, even with a banked fire, warmed stones, and livestock nearby, the cold could still penetrate everything. That's where architecture stepped in. Medieval cottages weren't poorly built, they were purpose-built. Their small size wasn't just a reflection of poverty, it was a thermal strategy. Smaller homes required less heat. The walls, made of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven wooden strips covered in clay, mud, and often animal dung, tracked heat surprisingly well. When dried and packed, these walls insulated against the wind far better than one might expect from such humble materials. Builders knew that cow dung made stronger daub than horse dung. They didn't need thermometers or thermal imaging. They had experience carved into every handprint on those walls. The roofs were feats of survival engineering. Thatched from layers of straw or reeds, they could be over a foot thick. Between the stalks were thousands of tiny air pockets, creating a natural insulation barrier. A well-made thatch roof not only kept out the rain and snow, but also held in precious warmth. These roofs were high maintenance and flammable, yes, but they did their job. And when it came to windows, well, most homes didn't have them. Glass was unheard of in peasant cottages. Instead, openings were covered with cloth, wooden shutters, or even animal hide during winter. Some homes had no windows at all, relying solely on the open doorway and smoke hole above the fire to let in light and release smoke. Floors were another battlefield in the war against cold. Stone or dirt was the standard, but people didn't sleep on bare ground. They covered it in layers of straw, rushes, or even dried animal hair. Over time, these layers formed a kind of composting carpet, thick and warm, if not exactly clean. Fresh layers were added throughout the season, and yes, it got messy. But that messy organic carpet trapped warmth and kept people's bodies from touching the freezing floor. Sleeping areas were arranged with care. The warmest corner, often farthest from the door and closest to the hearth, was reserved for the most vulnerable, babies, the elderly, and the sick. Everyone else arranged themselves around the fire or livestock, maximizing proximity to heat. And if someone snored or talked in their sleep, you ignored it. If they had cold feet and used yours as a heater, you accepted it. The shared discomfort was less important than the shared warmth. Even clothing was strategic. Medieval peasants didn't change into pajamas. They slept in whatever they wore during the day. When you only owned one or two outfits, you didn't take them off at night. You layered them. Wool was the best fabric because it stayed warm even when damp. One good wool tunic could serve a person for years, passed down and patched repeatedly until it became more repair than original cloth. Layering wasn't about fashion. It was about trapping heat. People wore every article of clothing they owned during the winter months, often sleeping in hats and scarves indoors. While modern myths say we lose 50% of our body heat through our heads, the real number is closer to 10%. Still, that 10% mattered when you had no backup heating. Shoes were usually removed to preserve them, but socks, if you had any, stayed on. Often these were nothing more than wrapped rags. Those lucky enough to have real socks darned and repaired them until they were mostly holes stitched together by hope and wool thread. Darning wasn't a hobby, it was a survival skill. Blankets as we know them today were rare. Families used worn-out cloaks, patched hides, or damaged wool pieces that no longer served as clothing. They piled these covers atop the whole family. And if someone hogged the blanket, it wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. On the coldest nights, when the frost crept along the inside walls and every exhale turned into a visible cloud, even the layered clothing and smoldering fire sometimes weren't enough. That's when the animals played their most critical role. Livestock weren't just tolerated indoors, they were welcomed, not because people romanticized farm life, but because animals generated heat. A single cow could produce roughly the same warmth as a small space heater, emitting around 5,000 BTUs per hour. Medieval peasants had no idea what BTUs were, but they knew that having a cow in the house could mean the difference between surviving the night or freezing in their sleep. Goats, pigs, chickens, all were valuable heat sources, each contributing to the delicate balance of life and warmth. The sleeping arrangements in many homes included animals positioned just feet from where the family lay. If the family was relatively well off, they might have been able to construct a low wooden partition to keep the livestock contained. But in most homes, there was no separation at all. A goat could be chewing beside your head, and you wouldn't swat it away. A chicken might nest under the bedding, adding a touch of warmth and companionship. Even pigs, often seen as dirty, were allowed indoors during the harshest months. Hygiene, understandably, took a back seat to warmth. If that meant dealing with the smell of manure and the occasional mess, so be it. Winter survival demanded tolerance, not tidiness. And yet, for all the discomfort, medieval peasants found ways to make it work. Their homes were built intentionally small, not because of a lack of ambition, but because heating a compact space was easier. Every inch mattered. The walls made of wattle and daub insulated far better than they appeared, and when combined with a thick thatch roof, the effect was significant. The design of these homes wasn't aesthetic, it was strategic. Windows were minimized or completely absent to retain heat, and doorways were often covered with layers of cloth or hide to reduce drafts. These weren't homes built to impress, they were built to endure. The floors were living insulation. Layers of rushes, straw, and animal hair formed a dense padding that kept the cold of the earth from seeping into sleeping bodies. Over the course of the winter, these materials decomposed slowly underfoot, releasing small amounts of heat in the process. While the idea of a composting floor might sound horrifying to modern sensibilities, it was a practical solution. In homes where every degree of warmth counted, peasants used whatever nature gave them. Nothing was wasted. Even excrement from livestock, dried and pressed, was sometimes used as fuel for the hearth or additional wall plaster. Medieval peasants didn't see filth. They saw fuel, insulation, and survival tools. Nighttime in a medieval peasant home was never quiet. The crackle of fire, the rhythmic chewing of goats, the occasional cluck from a chicken or snort from a pig created a kind of soundtrack to survival. Add to that the human sounds, snoring, coughing, murmuring in sleep, and the result was a symphony of endurance. And yet, these sounds weren't a nuisance. They were comforting. In the middle of winter, silence could mean danger. A quiet room might signal that someone had passed out from cold or worse. Noise meant life. Movement meant heat. Everything mattered. Even the way peasants slept reflected their reality. In regions where floor space was especially limited, some families slept sitting upright, leaning against walls or each other for support. This wasn't a cultural quirk. It was necessity. In the coldest parts of Europe, some homes were built with built-in wall shelves that functioned as sleeping platforms, like primitive bunk beds. These niches offered a slightly warmer place to rest and got people off the freezing floor, even if just by a few feet. The word niche in medieval building contexts often referred to these carved-out spaces, valuable real estate when warmth was scarce. Children didn't have separate rooms, let alone beds. From infancy, they were conditioned to sleep beside adults, absorbing not just body heat, but the rhythm of communal rest. They grew up recognizing the sounds and smells of nighttime survival as normal. Teenagers didn't storm off for privacy. They had nowhere to storm off to. The only door was the front door, and slamming it would invite in a blast of freezing air that could kill the mood and maybe someone else's chances of surviving the night. Discipline was enforced not through shouting, but through a deeply ingrained understanding that selfish actions had collective consequences. Even waking up was a calculated process. Clothes weren't changed because taking them off meant losing a critical barrier of warm air trapped next to the skin. Putting on ice-cold garments in the morning was one of the worst parts of the day. So people layered up before bed and never shed those layers unless absolutely necessary. Some families even used old sacks, dried leaves, or whatever dry material they could find to supplement their clothing as extra cover. Blankets, if they existed, were precious heirlooms, often shared by multiple generations at once. Everything served double or triple duty. Nothing was decorative. Everything was functional. And yet, despite all the discomforts, the resilience of medieval peasants remains astonishing. They endured winters without modern heating, without electricity, without clean bedding or proper clothing. They slept with animals, on straw, wrapped in whatever they could find, and woke up each morning ready to work fields or care for livestock again. Their strength didn't come from comfort. It came from adaptability, community, and an intimate knowledge of their environment. Every habit, every tool, every strategy was shaped by necessity. Today, we pull thick duvets over us and complain if the thermostat dips below 70. But for centuries, people survived brutal winters in conditions we'd find unbearable. So the next time you curl up in your soft bed, with its memory foam and heated blanket, think of the families who once huddled together on the floor, wrapped in rags, warmed by fire, livestock, and the sheer will to survive. And their story isn't just about hardship, it's about ingenuity, grit, and the quiet courage to endure.